Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. Welcome to our seminar today, where we're featuring Dan Immergluck, talking about his new book, Red Hot City: Housing, Race, and Exclusion in 21st Century Atlanta. Really excited to have Dan here. Before I turn to Dan, just to give you an update on upcoming events at the Joint Center. We have a busy week this week where we have an event on Friday, another book release, Stacked Decks, Building Inspectors and Reproduction of Urban Inequality, a new book by Robin Bertram, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Tulane, talking about her work in Chicago, looking at how the building inspectors make difficult choices and impact low-income homeowners. So another really interesting book talk. So that's at midday on Friday. And then next Tuesday, we are co-hosting an event with the Taubman Center on the next generation of state and local leaders, Annika Lescott Martinez, who is Chief Financial Officer and Executive Vice President of Finance at the New York City Housing Authority. So two really interesting events. Hope to see you there. But today, we're very excited to have Dan Immergluck with us. Dan is professor at Georgia State. This is his fourth book. Kind of a shame to be standing here with someone who is prolific as Dan, producing some really wonderful books through the years. We're excited to have this new book, which really is an intersection of a lot of Dan's interests and areas of expertise around neighborhood change, around housing finance, around racial equity. Really interesting story about the history of racial inequality in the city of Atlanta and Atlanta suburbs. Really compelling story, lots of lessons to be drawn. So really excited to have Dan here with us. So Dan, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks so much. Thanks to you and to David and the Joint Center for having me today. I'll get started pretty quickly. This book has been really the results of a catharsis of.
Dan, one thing,
sorry.
We're not seeing the display. We're seeing your.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Display mode.
Yep, there we go.
Perfect. All set.
Really a catharsis of 17 years of research, of writing, of advocacy on the side, and of teaching, all in Atlanta. Before that, a lot of work in Chicago and other places. But it's a book about what might have been. It's a book about missed opportunities, and hopefully there's, lessons for Atlanta, but as importantly, lessons for other cities. I view Atlanta as what I call a paradigmatic case of a growing Sunbelt city, which there are many, especially those facing significant gentrification pressures, racial change, ethnic change, and particularly those who are facing conservative state policy regimes, as is very common in the Sun Belt. I'm doing this a little differently than I do lots of presentations. It's a combination of kind of traditional academic presentation, especially the slides, but I'm also going to be reading brief excerpts from the book to give you a taste of the book, a taste of the style and the tone of the book. You'll see the table of contents there, besides the introduction and the conclusion, and I'm going to walk through highlights of each chapter. I don't have time to go into details on each chapter. Chapter 1 really starts with the origins of the city and really is the background for the rest of the book and goes up through the end of the 20th century. You can see, for those folks not familiar with Atlanta, the left map shows, well, both maps show the current metropolitan area, which is 29 counties. It's huge. The gray core area is the city proper, about 500,000 people. The region is about 6 million people. And the map on the right shows the kind of growing urbanization over the decades. About 60% of the population is in those 5 core counties colored on the left. The chapter talks about the origins of race in the city and racial tension in the city, with anti-Black violence very early on, explicit attempts to racially zone the city explicitly, and then the move to what I call racialized zoning after the courts strike down explicit racial zoning. The book talks about what Atlanta is already quite well known for among urban scholars, which is the Atlanta urban regime, this coalition between the white corporate leadership and the Black subordinate power structure in the city that Mayor Hartsfield during the middle part of the 20th century really developed and perfected, but really continues until this day. This has been written about by lots of authors, perhaps most famously by Clarence Stone. The chapter also talks about the process of negotiated racial transition and the creation of Black neighborhoods in the city through explicit planning processes to avoid continued racial violence, and also the development of Black suburbs. Even before World War II, Atlanta really led the nation in terms of the development of Black suburbanization and Black suburbs. The chapter goes on in terms of the kind of post-war history of the metro and the city, with the discussing the annexation of Buckhead, the affluent white neighborhood to the north, and to many of these earlier Black suburbs, so that the city grew by a factor of 3 geographically in 1952. It talks about urban renewal, highways, and other forms of Black neighborhood isolation and Black neighborhood removal. It talks about suburbanization in the region after World War II, and especially after 1970, which was extensive and really massive. And it talks very importantly about the period of the 70s and 80s and early 90s, where Atlanta was in fact a declining city in terms of population, in terms of white flight, in terms of growing poverty, but also talks about how this attitude of a shrinking city was hard to shake, even when the city started to experience earlier stages of gentrification in the late 80s and early 90s, especially around the 1996 Olympics. And finally, the chapter closes with the discussion of the well-documented demolition of most family public housing in the city. Atlanta had one of the worst performing public housing authorities in the country, and its response to this was not to try to improve that stock, to try to change it, but really was to demolish it and redevelop those neighborhoods for a different segment of the population. And I close the chapter with a paragraph that reads, by demolishing stigmatized and problematized sites in the city and dispersing the poor residents living there, the housing authority provided an important ingredient in the revalorization of the city, including in key locations such as the Old Fourth Ward, Midtown, Eastlake, and others. By dispersing the poor away from these sites, the agency assisted the real estate market in exploiting substantial rent gaps. With public housing removed and the reality or perception of lower crime and fewer Black low-income neighbors, real estate investors could put the land to quote unquote its highest and best use, which often effectively meant higher income and fewer Black residents. Chapter 2 turns to a central project in 21st century Atlanta. It turns to the Beltline. The Beltline, if you're not familiar with it, is a 22-mile ring of proposed trails and future light rail around the core of the city, built on top of an old abandoned rail network. It was planned in the early 2000s. A tax increment financing district was adopted in 2005 to fund it. It's estimated to cost in overall at least $5 billion. I write no redevelopment project in the Atlanta region, and arguably in the country, has been more transformative than the Atlanta Beltline. Developers, consultants, urban boosters, and many public officials saw the promise of a major city-led public-private partnership built on the back of expected rising property values to reshape the city both physically and demographically. Even before the first trails were opened at the tail end of the foreclosure crisis, the signs were there. As early as 2004, well before the Beltline tax increment financing district was adopted in late 2005, property values near the district began rising rapidly, and speculators began scooping up nearby properties. Alexander Garvin, the famous landscape architect, wrote in his Emerald Necklace report in 2004 about the Beltline. Quote, "The Beltline's future users are an attractive market. Early word of the project has already accelerated real estate values," unquote. The idea that speculators were already scooping up properties and bidding up land values wasn't a problem for Garvin and many other boosters of the Beltline. In fact, in April of 2004, a developer proclaimed that the Beltline was, quote, "the most exciting real estate project since Sherman burned Atlanta," unquote. The statement, if jarring, was revealing because decades of disinvestment had effectively devastated the neighborhood surrounding many parts of the Beltline. In 2007, I did a study with a community group of home values from 2000 to 2006 near the Beltline, and I found that they increased by more than 130% over this period, more than 3 times the rate of growth farther from the Beltline. In 2016, the architect of the Beltline, Ryan Gravel, and Nathaniel Smith, the CEO of the Partnership for Southern Equity, resigned from the Beltline over affordable housing issues. In 2017, I updated the study for a post-crisis era, 2011 to 2016, and found that home values were again increasing much faster near the Beltline than farther away from it. In 2017, the AJC did a series on the failures of the Beltline to follow through on its modest affordable housing goals 12 years after the tax increment financing district was adopted. And that series led to the ousting of the CEO of the Beltline. I write, this transformative project effectively reshaped the built environment in core city neighborhoods, regardless who would end up living there. The project was the product of a coalition of institutional actors, including core members of the urban regime, working toward a vision of a more affluent and whiter city population. While the Beltline was not the only cause of gentrification and racial exclusion in the city, it was a key contributor. It was a highly political project, emblematic of a city obsessed with the next big thing. Chapter 3 focuses again on the city, but on the broader patterns of gentrification in the city and on the policies that really failed to capture a significant share of the tremendous growth in land values for public benefit. I write, during the 21st century, and especially following the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis, employers began practically tripping over themselves to locate in the city of Atlanta. Jobs increased from 330,000 in 2011 to 437,000 by 2019. Many of these jobs paid over $100,000. Firms like NCR, Honeywell, Google, Microsoft, Invesco, and others located into the city. Over the longer 1990 to 2019 period, as shown in the chart on the upper left, the city's percent of the population that was Black fell from 67% to 48%. The percent of adults that were college educated rose from 27% to 56%, hardly the same population. And the city median income rose from 60% of the metropolitan median to 110% of the metropolitan median, so that the city was substantially more affluent on average than the suburbs. In fact, median family income in the city in 2021 dollars grew from $50,000 in 1990 to almost $100,000 in 2019. What I really focus on, though, is the period from 2010 to 2019, when the number of low-cost rental units, those priced at less than $800 a month in 2019 dollars, had dropped by 7,000 units over only a 9-year period. That's a loss of over 20%. But the city did not lose rental units over that period. Over that 9-year period, occupied rental units grew by 24,000 units, a 25% increase in the city. The bulk of these new units rented, though, for over $1,500 a month, many of those over $2,000 a month. So the higher cost rental stock had doubled over 9 years, while the lower cost stock had declined markedly. I talk in the chapter about 3 fundamental characteristics of a public finance structure that fundamentally fails to capture this increased land value for public purposes, including and especially affordable housing. First, the city has had 2 competing development authorities that provide property tax breaks to large commercial real estate developers, mostly in hot market neighborhoods, and they're competing with each other to offer the best tax breaks. Secondly, and most importantly, the property tax system in Fulton County, the main county in Atlanta, favors large commercial property owners who regularly appeal their appraised values and get them lowered to well below market value, often at 50% or less of market value. And finally, the city has enacted tax limitation policies that benefit homeowners and rolled back their taxes, and this disproportionately benefited upper income families. I write, despite the city's land values growing tremendously after 2012, the citizens of Atlanta, especially the non-property owning ones, did not benefit nearly as much as the city's growth and increased land from the city's growth and increased land values as they should have. The vast majority of the benefits of the growth accrued to landowners, speculators, and investors. The city has been on a planned and subsidized trajectory supporting the gentrification starting before the 1996 Olympics. After clearing out most of its public housing, the city was primed for rapid change. Despite the city's transformation, local government continued to act as if it was still the 1980s, as if Atlanta was still a shrinking city. The city continued to cater to capital and excessively subsidize and undertax commercial property. Chapter 4 turns to the region as a whole, the city and the suburbs. I write, the subprime crisis that began in 2007 hit Atlanta hard, and it hit Black families and neighborhoods the hardest. The crisis and its aftermath were the products of a perfect storm of federal deregulation and yield-hungry capital markets, and then a timid federal response to surging foreclosures combined with weak state and local implementation. In 2010, for example, the U.S. Treasury Department awarded the state of Georgia $340 million in federal hardest hit fund dollars to assist homeowners at risk of foreclosure. By early 2012, the city had provided only $23 million to homeowners. In 2007, SIGTARP, the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, released a scathing audit of Georgia Department of Community Affairs Hardest Hit Fund program. The SIGTARP press release stated that, quote, DCA has consistently ranked among the least effective state agencies in the nation in dispersing hardest hit fund dollars. DCA argued back that it needed to guard these federal funds for taxpayers. Yet SIGTARP countered that DCA was was, quote, guarding the HHF funds from Georgians who within 30 days could not get the IRS to issue and stamp a tax transcript, or their employer to issue a letter saying the unemployment was not the homeowner's fault. They even, quote unquote, guarded the funds from one woman who could not continue in her job while undergoing chemotherapy for breast cancer, unquote. Then I talk about the federal role in a fundamental change in housing in the region. At the tail end of the crisis in 2011 and 2012, federal policymakers encouraged large-scale Wall Street-backed private equity firms to enter the single-family rental market. Starting in 2012, these firms began buying up tens of thousands of foreclosed homes in the region and other mostly Sunbelt metros. Atlanta was an ideal quote-unquote strike zone for these private equity giants, given its large number of foreclosures flowing through the system, weak tenant protections, and strong demand for housing, with many households shut out of the mortgage market. The result of these forces was a major transfer of tens of thousands of single-family homes from homeowners, including many families of color, to investors, including a new institutional breed of investor. In January 2012, the Federal Reserve, in fact, released a paper on the growing glut of foreclosed homes. The authors of this paper argued that policymakers had a choice between allowing families to purchase more homes at a time when values were very low, or spurring a speedier flow of these homes to large-scale institutional investors. The white paper was cited repeatedly in investor prospectuses and private equity pitches at invitation-only country club lunches. Within a few weeks, Warren Buffett, in a widely cited interview, proclaimed that he would purchase a couple of 100,000 single-family homes if he could. Policymakers opted to facilitate the scooping up of low-valued foreclosed properties by large investors rather than to support the ability of Black and and less affluent families to purchase homes. In doing so, they steered land wealth towards an increasingly concentrated ownership structure and away from the groups who had been hit so hard by the crisis. Chapter 5 shifts to the suburbs explicitly. It is mostly about the continual process of exclusion of households of color and lower income families from more affluent suburbs, and the remaking of places in those suburbs that are encountering growing diversity into whiter, more affluent spaces. What we saw in the period from the 90s through the 2010s is growing diversity in the 5 core counties in those suburbs. We saw a growing suburbanization of poverty in these 5 core suburbs, as shown on the map on the right. In fact, the region just from 2000 to 2019 had grown tremendously, from a population of just over 4 million to more than 6 million. It had turned from a majority white region to a minority white region. And 80% of this growth, of this 2 million person growth over this 20-year period, was Blacks, Latinx, and Asian persons. A major focus of Chapter 5 concerns the continued and re-energized efforts at racial and economic exclusion in the northern suburbs, north of the city, to push back on this growing diversity and to maintain affluence and whiteness. Just north of the city of Atlanta, the city of Sandy Springs, which had incorporated in 2005 after Republicans gained control of all branches of government. In Sandy Springs, they developed the Gateway Project. They funded it with a new development authority that issued $100 million in bonds in 2014 to fund a 21-acre mixed-use redevelopment. The websites for the project portrayed it as demolishing quote-unquote outdated rental buildings to replace them with quote-unquote first-rate apartment living and commercial properties. The project involved the demolition of 1,100 older rental units, displacing an estimated 3,000 residents, over 80% of whom were estimated to be Black and Latinx. In Marietta, another suburb to the northwest, in 2013, Marietta proposed a $68 million bond to redevelop a 1.2 mile corridor of Franklin Road, home to older apartment buildings and retail and a significant Black and Latinx population. Two local politicos active in Republican County politics formed Revitalize Marietta to push for the redevelopment scheme. One of them said to the local paper, quote, "We see communities that ignore problems and eventually suffer the loss of identity and the loss of economic activity and the loss of the middle class. And we saw that happening in Marietta. When bad government policies create high concentrations of slum-like housing, it takes the government to step in and help fix the problem," unquote. Marietta's mayor, who's still mayor, told the local paper in 2015, as the buildings were being demolished, that, quote, "It's almost like a dream. It's almost like it's 1970 again." The mayor blamed the area's problems on changes in 1988 to the Federal Fair Housing Act that expanded protection for families with children. He said, quote, "Without children, you had fewer problems. And with the change in the law, the apartments began to slide," unquote. I write at the end of the chapter, over the last 3 decades, the Atlanta suburbs have become increasingly diverse, both racially and economically as a whole. At the same time, many more affluent and whiter suburbs, especially those located in the favored northern quarter, have pushed back against this growing diversity that they've seen within and near their borders. Wealthier homeowners and local politicians have sought increased ability to exclude via secession and their greater zoning and policing powers it brings, but they've also actively worked with developers and others to subsidize the redevelopment of parts of their communities that house lower income Black and Latinx households, predominantly renters, resulting in large scale displacement and exclusion. So I'm going to end with the 4 key themes of the book. The first is the kind of obvious spatial restructuring in the region with heavily racialized gentrification in the city of Atlanta and growing diversity in the suburbs, but faced by attempts to exclude in the most affluent communities, exclude that growing diversity and push back against it. The second key theme is the failure of the city of Atlanta to capture a significant share of the tremendous growth in property values and land values in the city and devote some significant share of those to affordable housing to allow for continued inclusion in the city. The third theme, which I haven't had much time to talk about, and is common in growing cities in red states especially, is that state government has shaped redevelopment at the local level, often to the detriment of the most vulnerable to exclusion and displacement. It seems to serve the interest of landlords, developers, lenders, and homeowners associations. Local governments are given the power to exclude and displace affordable housing, but not to provide stronger tenant protections, not to provide rent stabilization, and not to provide fair housing regulations. All of these things preempted by state government. The fourth theme and the overarching theme is that the city and the suburbs have passed through a series of inflection points going back to the Olympics, during which planning and policy choices robustly and repeatedly favored exclusion and displacement over equity and inclusion. I'll close by just reading a couple of paragraphs from the end of the book. Some witnessing the sorts of racial and economic exclusion described in this book argue that these patterns are inevitable in growing cities and regions like Atlanta. Where the conditions are ripe, they suggest that rampant gentrification is preordained, a product of market forces that cannot be altered or slowed. These observers are also likely to argue that suburban redevelopment in a revanchist, racialized, displace and replace fashion is unavoidable. Such responses are perhaps understandable, especially without grasping the mechanisms of how urban and suburban places get reimagined, reshaped, and remade. They reflect a failure to understand the reality that, like it or not, government is responsible for establishing and regulating many of the institutional structures within which markets operate, and so bears a significant share of responsibility for the racialized exclusion and displacement of poor communities. The changes in Atlanta over the last 25 years, much like the changes in the 20th century, are not the result of apolitical, impersonal, anonymized market forces. The city is a politically and socially constructed space, and its trajectories are the products of policy decisions. No single change in policy or planning will by itself reverse the trends of exclusion that bear down hardest on those whose lives are most precarious. Yet changes to how major projects get done, how they are financed, and whether planners and deal makers are forced to consider the immediate and longer term questions of who benefits and who is harmed from the next big placemaking project can and do make a difference. Many of the policy choices that have been made in the region since the 1990s could have been made differently in ways that would have led to less gentrification and displacement, more housing stability and affordability for low-income families, and less reshuffling of poor families, mostly households of color, from one place to another. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan. It's a job to summarize a book in 30 minutes, but you did a great job, and a great job too of giving us a flavor of what it covers and the tone. So that was really terrific. We have a bunch of encourage people to put your questions in the Q&A. I'll get to those in a minute. I was going to engage with Dan a bit in some conversations on my own questions. This may be a kind of a risky proposition, Dan, but I was going to try to boil down the kind of takeaways about what one should do to not repeat these mistakes, and see how this list resonates with you. And number one, I mean, you're talking about a red hot city, right? And as we think about trying to deal with issues of housing affordability, of displacement, and like very different market dynamic in a place like Cleveland or Detroit than Atlanta. And I know we've had a class that I've taught with some other folks here about local government solutions. And when you're in Atlanta, a place like Atlanta or Las Vegas or Austin or Denver, you know, you have growth, you have a real opportunity to, number one, as you say in the book many times, it said just now, to capture value. And so it seems like rule number one is, particularly in hot cities, capture value. Rule number two is and invest that in permanently affordable housing. And so what you're doing is you're making sure that people can stay there in that community. Third, I would say, is to center the voices and interests of the existing residents in the process of planning and raising those taxes and making those investments. And then lastly, more broadly, is protect renters to the extent that you can. Is that a good list?
That's a great list. I would say, I completely agree that thinking about this stuff is contextual on, you know, how hot the housing market is. But one theme of the book is don't wait too long. You know, don't wait until there were opportunities in the narrative of the book and the narrative of the last 25 years for actually the city to have a bit of a reset. You know, values were increasing significantly in the 2000s, and then the crash came and values declined. And yet, even though, you know, I had written this paper on the Beltline saying that values increased a lot, they came back down. Yet, even though we had seen this happen before, there was no planning for saying, oh, values are really low now. We can get single family lots for $15,000. Maybe we should figure out how to buy some of them. And we have all this NSP money, neighborhood stabilization program money. Maybe we should think about how to bank properties and keep them for long-term affordable instead of just flipping them all to whoever will buy them because we just want to get rid of them, which was kind of the context. And part of that I actually blame HUD for, because it pushed local governments to go through properties as quickly as possible. But there was very little effort to think strategically about banking land early on when it was cheap. And I think that's something that even lower growth cities that might be poised for growth should think about. I'm going to do a talk tomorrow for the housing summit in Memphis. And Memphis is a low growth city right now, but it has some characteristics, right? It is in the Sun Belt. It has some characteristics that could turn that around. And you might say, well, Memphis looks a little bit like Atlanta did in the late 80s. And, it should be thinking about, it does have a land bank, but it should be thinking about preparing for, and at least not waiting 20 years for. An example, to not go on too long, is that we eventually did get a land trust in Atlanta to start, basically creating permanently affordable housing around the Beltline. They created a version that didn't work very well in about 2008, 2009, but it was really not until 2018 that they created a workable land trust, which is now acquiring properties. But the cost of land now is at least 10 times what it was at the bottom of the cycle after the crisis. So part of it is also, don't wait too long and don't let this get ahead of you, because when you miss these inflection points, people say, well, are we at inflection point now? We are, because housing is a very hot issue in Atlanta, and we have a mayor who seems to be a little more serious about it, but it's a lot harder to do now, a lot harder.
Right. We were talking earlier, and you were saying that some of the folks responding to your book were saying, well, it's easy to have 20/20 hindsight. But in this respect, when you talk about major investment like the Beltline and the parks and the trails and that went with it, you don't really need to have much of 20/20 hindsight to know what impact that's going to have. But it is hard. I remember being one time in a conversation with George McCarthy at the Lincoln Institute, and he was doing work in Detroit. And he was raising the point and saying Detroit needs now to start thinking about locking in values. And people were like looking at him and saying, this is a shrinking city. And he's like, well, you have to plan now for your success. Yep. And it can be hard to know when that pivot point is, but clearly between now and where we are today in 1990, there are plenty of points where Atlanta could have, would have, should have seen that. Somebody was asking a question in the chat about whether there are other places that have done better at capturing this, like the 11th Street Bridge project in DC comes to mind. Are there others, right, or you can talk about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I am no expert on, on the 11th Street Bridge project or the LA River project, but it does seem like people have learned from the Beltline, to some degree, the 606 Trail in Chicago, the High Line, that you've got to think ahead, and at least the intent, more clear intent with the 11th Street Bridge project, setting up the Douglas Land Trust earlier, doing an analysis of parcels that I saw done by the Urban Institute, of the 11th Street Bridge project area. They've certainly front-funded community development there. We front-funded park development around the Beltline, which is the exact thing that drives up the land values. There was a provision in the original TIF to set aside 15% of the bond proceeds for affordable housing. The problem was most of the funding for the first 12 years was not bond proceeds. It was either philanthropic and city money and other monies, because the bond market wasn't doing too well, right? This was Great Recession and afterwards, and there were some lawsuits. But even the TIF money that was generated wasn't funding bonds. So they weren't under the obligation to put those monies towards affordable housing, and they didn't. Well, that goes to political will. I actually think they didn't need, the ordinance telling them what to do. They could have just spent more money on assembling properties at a time when values were very low if they were really serious about affordable housing. I think under political pressure, they are now more serious at the Beltline, but I don't think they were for the first 12 to 15 years.
So we talked about capturing value, having a long-term vision, building in permanent affordability. The other thing I mentioned in my short list was centering voices and interests of renters, and particularly renters of color. One of the questions that came in is, what are policy solutions to protect racialized renters beyond inclusionary policies? Whose responsibility is it to create and maintain these policies, individual, local government, or state? In the book, you talk about the fact that there aren't enough organizations and organized groups to represent those voices. There's some efforts, I think you talk about in the book, to do that. They seem like they often got drowned out or co-opted by more powerful interests. So how would you answer that question? What can and should be done to create more power and voice for these folks?
Another excellent question, and it's a real challenge. I spent, as Chris knows, I spent a good deal of time in Chicago before Atlanta, and there was just much more of an organizational culture of opposition to kind of the coalitional efforts of big government and corporate interest in Chicago. And of course, you had the Alinsky tradition and the neighborhood organizations and the Chicago Tenants Union. I think Atlanta may be the largest metro, and I may be wrong, without either statewide or metropolitan-wide, really grassroots tenant organization. We have good groups like the Housing Justice League. We have who are doing building by building organizing. We have some newer groups that are getting interested in housing, and that's really good. But it's really a challenge in Atlanta, partly because we don't have the MacArthur foundations and the Ford foundations that have funded more progressive work. Our local foundations tend to be quite conservative. So that's part of the issue. But also my thing lately, I was on the mayor's transition committee, and I said, the mayors of the state need to tie together, because this state preemption stuff, where you can't even pass any kind of laws that interfere in real estate transactions of almost any kind, needs to end. There needs to be real local control that can be exercised on the behalf of tenants and not just landowning interests. And mayors are the ones who should be doing this. And unfortunately, our Georgia Municipal Association is not interested. I think there's too much log rolling with Georgia Apartments Association, Georgia Realtors Association. So it's about building power. It's old-fashioned organizing, Galeson-Cotta type organizing. It's about building power, but I'd like to see mayors, including especially the mayor of Atlanta, step up and call for this, so that at least, there's broader support than just that might lead to funding, that might lead to organizing resources. Other people have pointed to, we have very good grassroots organizing around elections. We have arguably, Fair Fight is one of the best grassroots organizing. We need to take that infrastructure and not just bring it up every 2 or 4 years when there's an election. We need to take that infrastructure and use it for tenant organizing.
It is, I think you've described what has to happen, and it is challenging politically. It is a big old-fashioned organizing issue. And in a state like Georgia, where you have Republican control of the state power levers who are not sympathetic to a lot of these views, it's challenging in particular. Do you see a role for the federal government to help build those local voices? You talk about mayors, I'm reminded of back, the 60s and the programs to try to get money flowing into cities, the maximum feasible participation, which obviously had a lot of blowback, but that was a situation where the federal government did empower local organizations. Is there a place for the federal government to try to help circumvent the state and help the local folks?
There absolutely is. Of course, in this, the toxicity of the federal environment is, to me, worse than the state and local one. Even the state legislative one in terms of, what, I mean, think about what happened to Acorn. Think about what happened to, even in a less toxic time. So talk about a challenge, but I agree. I think resources, frankly, I think it's more likely to come from foundations than it is from the federal government. But yes, if that can be done, I think it would be great. My bigger question is, do even Democrats shy away from that kind of action right now?
Right. All right, switching gears a little bit. One of the other themes in the book, and a clear theme coming through the Q&A, has to do with the role of investors in the market. There's some questions just to kind of clarify, and I don't think you had a chance to go into it a great deal in your presentation about what happened with the investors in Atlanta. And I guess the one, you talk about the fact that we attribute this to market forces, and in many respects, it's a public-private partnership that created the opportunity for these things to happen. But there is a way in which the role of investors in private markets is something that we don't have a lot of great controls for. I mean, we certainly shouldn't be aiding and abetting them, but do you see, maybe say a bit about the role of investors and what's playing out in Atlanta, and what do you see as policies that could help level the playing field or tilt the playing field against investors to the extent that they are displacing would-be homeowners?
Good question. And I want to, I don't want to, and I don't think the book is all investors are bad. Obviously, we have a big single family rental market, always have had. It has gotten bigger, especially in the suburbs, since the foreclosure crisis. And my concerns are the investors good compared to bad? Or can we steer things towards good investors compared to bad investors? And I definitely think there's a good and bad. Not all big ones are, it's not just linear big equals bad, but some of the big ones, the premiums, have pretty bad track records with, pretty good data. So my number one answer is, if you look at where the large investors went, there seems to be two factors. The institutional investors, they went two places, mostly to the Sun Belt, some exceptions in maybe Northern California, and to the Midwest, but more to the Sun Belt. And the two factors that I think are big here are the job growth and employment growth, so that you have renters. You had lots of foreclosures in the Sun Belt and in the Midwest. So those are two initial factors. But the third factor that I think is big and is common in the South and in the Midwest is weak tenant protections. You don't see, if you look at a map, Desiree Fields, other people have done maps of where the large investors are. They're not in the Northeast. They're not on the coast mostly. There's some in California because it's such a lucrative market, but they're mostly in the Sun Belt, in the Phoenixes, the Atlantas, the Floridas, the Memphises, also in the Midwest to a lesser degree. But those are all places with weak tenant protections. So strengthen the tenant protections, and you at least push out and make less lucrative the kind of bottom feeders of the investor market. I think that's number one. Number two is transparency. I can't even easily find out who the investors are. The use of LLCs and nested LLCs and the lack of transparency of property ownership is a huge problem. So if I can't find out who they are, how can maybe the state attorney general, who is interested in whether Invitation Homes controls 20% of the market in a particular suburb, or theoretically whether the Securities and Exchange Commission or somebody else might be interested in either anti-competitive, oligopolistic market power that could result in lower quality and higher rents. So we need to know who's owning property, and the way to do that is state policy and ideally federal policy on LLC beneficial ownership. And, in many places, the other answer to this is rental registries. But again, like in Georgia, we would need a change in state policy to get the ability to do local rental registries. But that's another tool for transparency.
A couple of questions have come in on this topic around organizing tenants. And I'll throw a few threads out there. One of them has to do with the fact that you're in the Bible Belt, and that Linsky's IAF was faith-based. The civil rights movement had a strong faith-based. Is there a way in which churches, especially Black churches, can be leveraged towards this? Let me add a couple others. One is someone notes that that Atlanta now has source of income protection for renters. Is that true? And if so, how did that come about? Does that have any lessons for how to organize on these topics? And then one other person just said, can you give me a little more detail on what do you mean by improved tenant protections?
Sure. So on the first one, I definitely agree. And some Black churches have organized around housing issues, organized forums. I get invited to talk quite regularly about them. But I don't think in a way that is kind of cross-church IAF like Industrial Areas Foundation. We don't have a United Power for Action, as I don't know if it's still called that in Chicago, which was the IAF church-based group. We don't have, that I know of, we don't have something that muscular. That's why I think there are opportunities with Fair Fight, with the New Georgia Project, with all the kind of political organizing groups to, basically spread their capital into long-term legislative tenant organizing kinds of things. What was the second question again? It was a good question. I'm just
so source of income, and then
so Atlanta did pass a source of income protection ordinance a few years ago. Very eager councilman who's no longer on council. Unfortunately, he was told at the time that it was preempted by state law, and in fact, it is preempted by state law. So a number of councilmen have brought it up, but the legal opinions are pretty clear. It's not legal in the city of Atlanta, and it's certainly not being enforced. So unless we get that state, it's basically, ironically, it is the State Fair Housing Act, which preempts anything that looks like anti-discrimination laws at the local level.
And the other question was just when you say tenant protections,
so Georgia has one of the weakest landlord tenant regimes from the tenant side. Advocates have been trying to pass for a few years now, just something as simple as a right to cure notice requirement before the eviction filing is filed. We're one of the few states where you can just, a day after the tenant is late, you can slap an eviction notice on the tenant's door. Most states you have 7 to 10 or more days where you have to give the tenant the ability to cure their arrears before that. And that's really important, as tenant advocates know, because just an eviction filing itself creates problems for tenants. It makes it hard, especially in this market, for tenants to find other housing. It, to some degree, puts them in a worst case housing scenario where they're captive to some of the not so great landlords who will accept people with recent filings. Other example, we have nothing that looks remotely like any kind of just cause. There's nothing saying that you have to renew a tenant's lease if they've performed on the lease. There's nothing saying a tenant can withhold money from their rent if there's a problem with the unit. There's just a plethora of eviction problems. It's one of the fastest evicting states. We have one of the highest eviction filing levels in the country. There's just a number of problems, and we have absolutely, rent control is, anything that looks like rent control is preempted by the state.
Well, Dan, we have a few minutes left, and we touched upon this a little bit. I'm just curious. You mentioned that you have spent time in Chicago for a number of years. One of the things I love about your work is that as a housing person, the Joint Center, we tend to focus on housing at a national level, but very high level. And in fact, housing is very, very much a local issue. And your work is really always very grounded in local market conditions, which makes it rich. So having spent time thinking a lot about Chicago, now you've been in Atlanta for a good long time. What any kind of quick contrasts or similarities between the two as you think about these issues? One of the things I like about Chicago is that it's one of the few places that has it all, in the sense that they have both parts of the city that are subject to decades-long disinvestment and other places that are rapidly gentrifying. So it's unlike Atlanta, I think, where it's just hot all over. But anyway, quick.
Yeah, they're more suburbanized now. There are places in Atlanta that are, and a few kind of outskirt neighborhoods in Atlanta that are not experiencing much pressure, but it is pretty much hot all over in the city proper. We're not as big as Chicago. A few things I've noticed. One is neighborhoods change quicker in Atlanta. They're less dense, they're smaller. A neighborhood in Atlanta can be a few thousand people. A neighborhood in Chicago is often 20,000 people. Or 10,000 people. And the durability of kind of decline and disinvestment in Black neighborhoods in Chicago has been much stronger. And people sometimes rely on, Chicago gets a disproportionate share of scholarly attention in urban scholarship. And people sometimes rely on scholarship from Chicago, say, well, Black neighborhoods don't gentrify. And I'm like, come down to Atlanta. I'll show you that's not true. Well, in the city proper, Chicago, you have many Latinx neighborhoods. You have many very diverse neighborhoods. In Atlanta, until recently, especially, it's been pretty much a black-white in the city proper. The ethnic growth and the Asian and Latinx growth in Atlanta has been suburban, like in many southern cities. So we are now seeing gentrification of Latinx suburban communities. I write about it, particularly along this corridor called the Buford Highway Corridor. But in the city proper, it's mostly Black neighborhoods that are gentrifying and have gentrified. So that's a marked difference. But as Alan Malik once said to me, well, it seems to be that if there are Latinx neighborhoods, sometimes the gentrification goes there first. But in Atlanta, there really weren't, except in the suburbs. So the market, which again is politically constructed and favors gentrification forces, oftentimes will find a way. It finds a way in Chicago, it finds a way in Atlanta, it even finds a way in Detroit. Maybe at a smaller scale. But in some ways, the biggest differences are ones I mentioned before. The political regime difference. In Chicago, my experience is much more contested, much more organizing, much more. I remember sitting on the city's housing department 5-year plan kind of advisory council and seeing detailed plans of where housing dollars would go. That doesn't happen in Atlanta.
Interesting. I would just give a shout out to the book too. You mentioned the Buford Highway area. The book has a great description about the multi-ethnic nature of that neighborhood, how it's evolved over time. So there's really some wonderful portraits in the book. Wish we had some more time to talk about that. But
Thank you.
We're getting to the hour. Like just give a broad wrap-up question that came through the chat. So given that you've been looking backwards, looking ahead, what do you think the future of Atlanta is going to be in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Is it going to be a recognizable, unrecognizable landscape? How will transit change things? What's your sense of where Atlanta goes from here? And I guess there could be your optimistic or your pessimistic view.
Yeah, my aspirational one is that the mayor actually just last week said in public that he was going to try to tackle the severe undertaxation of commercial properties. Some of his deputies have had a few meetings about it. We have a colleague at Georgia Tech has provided data showing this systematically, even though we kind of knew it was happening anyway. So there is some, the aspirational is we'll spend a lot more money on affordable housing, even though it's much more expensive now, and we will slow this kind of exclusionary process. The more perhaps realistic or pessimistic perspective is Atlanta will, I'm not going to use the kind of tired San Francisco comment, we're going to become San Francisco, whatever. I do think, we are going to have fewer and fewer places that low and moderate income families can survive economically. And so, part of the thing I didn't talk about that I do talk about in the book a bit is that the mass transit system in the city and in the 2 core counties is much better than everywhere else. And so as we push poor people out, they are delegated to places with very weak transit. And that's a huge problem. So are we better off? People say, well, were we better off in 1985 when the city was mostly poor and all the wealth was in the suburbs? And I'm like, that's a false choice. It's having all the wealth in the city and the poor excluded to the southern suburbs versus having a poor city. We can aim for something different than both of those. And hopefully that's my aspirational forecast that we will.
Well, thank you, Dan. Last plug for the book by Dan Immergluck, Red Hot City, Housing, Race, and Exclusion in the 21st Century Atlanta. Really fascinating story about the history of recent development in Atlanta, and one that has, as we've talked about today, lessons for lots of other places as well. Dan, well done in the book. Appreciate you spending time with us. And for all those of you listening in, great to see you, and come back soon to see us on Friday. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome, Dan. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.